always use the story of my grandfather. I tried to find him. He lived in, my great-grandfather and grandfather moved to St. Louis back in the 1880s. And I started doing some research on them, and I asked my dad one time, I said, were they just a step ahead of the sheriff, or what was going on? Because they moved about every year. And my dad didn't know, but as I have done more study about it, people were always looking for a better house. If they made more money, they upgraded themselves and found something. But my grandfather must have done it a lot, because he moved all the time, so I don't know. But everybody in America did. People were always moving west and looking for that next best opportunity. So with the transportation revolution of the railroads and the steamboats, people could much more easily do that, and anybody could. The newest immigrant from Europe could get to New York City and find a way to get on a railroad. He may have to work for a few days in New York City to make the fare to make it out to Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland or Pittsburgh even. But everybody could afford to do it, and a lot of people did. People were on the go. So the technology changes really opened up our country and made a difference in the way people lived and how they lived, and the information they could get. None of you can imagine the day when you don't look at your computer and your phone and figure out what's going on in the world, if you have any interest in that. But you can talk to any of your friends. Probably most of you do, because I see everybody getting their phones on when they get out of class. But at that time, people, once you left New York City, you almost never, you could write to people, but you couldn't call until, well, we didn't have phones until when, 1870, 75? And even then, it was not too normal. Probably after the 1900s, when we had telephones in many homes, not most, but many. So the communications and the technology of the transportation era of the 1820s to 1860s was a pretty dramatic change. Another thing that was going on, and that was thriving because of this, we began to see a lot of factories developed. We had what was called an industrial revolution. What does a revolution mean to you? Change. Rapid change frequently. The Industrial Revolution actually started in Great Britain, but the industrious Americans very quickly realized they needed to get in on this thing. So when I say an Industrial Revolution, that means we changed the way we work, what we produce, and how we produce it. For instance, in 1800, if you lived in New York City, you would have maybe two outfits that you wore. You might have one or two pairs of shoes. One is more likely. You probably had a hat, and you probably, or your mother, you or your mother probably made all that. By 1860, you probably had more clothes. You probably had shoes that were made in a factory, and surely a hat that was made in a factory. And you would have more of those, and they would cost you less. And you probably didn't produce them. In 1800, you probably made everything. Now, if you lived on a farm and didn't have access to all that, in 1845, we have the Singer sewing machine. Has anybody heard of the Singer sewing machine?
Yes.
What does the sewing machine do for you?
Make clothes.
Make clothes. If you lived on a farm like my grandmother, she had one that was not electric powered because she grew up when there was no electricity on the farm. She had one that you pumped the little tread wheel down there, and I never figured out how it worked. It was kind of magic when I was a little kid. But at any rate, she used it, knew how to use it, and she made clothes. Her mother taught her how to make clothes and use that. So that was a big technological change if you lived on a farm, and even city girls used it. But then people adapted that machine for making clothes in factories. So really by 1860, I don't have a firm number, but many people bought clothes because we had all these mills, especially in New England, which is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maine, and that area, up in the northeast corner of the country, where clothing was made. They primarily employed young people like you, sometimes younger. A lot of times girls that were 12 would come in and work. A lot of immigrant girls would come in because they could get hired and they were willing to work there. Many families had large families and sent their daughters, in this case daughters, to the mills because they were always hiring and looking for people. So it was a way for girls to make money and a way for low-cost production of goods that people wanted. The other part of this is that with the Industrial Revolution, Americans adapted new machinery to their factories. So the steam engine which was used on trains and on boats, steamboats, was being used in factories. And when you have steam power, you create a whole new set of jobs. You need somebody to run those, and you have new kinds of machinery. So they could make steel for the railroads, they had to make railroad tracks. Lumber mills were more efficient now because you were using machinery. One of the things that you might not think about until after the 1860s, as steam engines got more plentiful, all the mills in the New England area and Michigan and Wisconsin, places where there's winter, real winter, not our pretend winter here, the streams would freeze over. And every mill, every factory was by a stream or a river, because they had a wheel out there and that generated power for the plant. Well, when the stream or the river freezes over, there's no power. So everybody got laid off for 4 or 5 or 6 months, depending on how bad winter was. Now you could operate all year round. So that was a big change. We now had jobs available for many people 12 months a year. If you were working up in Lowell, Massachusetts, where many of the textile mills were, in the middle of the winter, sometime in December until February, March period, there was no work for you. So it created a new type of work, created more work in many respects, and it was more efficient. So we could produce more products at a lower cost and makes things more available. So that's another one, but probably the Industrial Revolution was one of the biggest changes. And that was going on, I think we could say 1820 to 1850 was the biggest chunk of time for that. And that also, we were a little sneaky. The Americans realized that the British were beating us. And they started sending spies to Great Britain. Well, Great Britain figured out real quick that they were going to lose their technological advantage if they didn't stop their engineers from going over to the United States. So what they did was they had kind of an embargo, which means you can't leave, or they would search you if you were known to be an engineer. If you were going from London to New York City and you worked at the British textile mill company, they wouldn't let you leave without going over everything to make sure you weren't sneaking plans out, because the Americans had figured out that they could buy you to come over to the United States and help them set up a factory just like was over there. And so eventually they had figured out what the machinery was that the British were using. And, whoops, that's me. Actually had that turned off. I forgot.
It's not a class day, so that's okay.
I can't even find it now. I guess it'll just run for a minute. At any rate, we imported a lot of engineers who helped build factories and the steam engines and the power supplies that were needed to get this going. And the reason I say that is because really by the mid-1830s and 40s, American technology was growing so fast. We had so many entrepreneurs. Everybody know what an entrepreneur is?
Yes.
What is an entrepreneur?
young people with strong desire to make.
They create their own business, they have an idea that they turn into a business. So you could think about Samuel F.B. Morse, who's invented the telegraph and then turned that into a business. Ultimately, it would become the company we know today.